The elevator pitch is the rapid ascent systems, when used effectively, both pre-acclimatization at home and excellent logistics and leadership, effectively make high altitude trips shorter and more fun. And I would argue increase both safety and success rates. And they do that by doing exactly the same thing you're going to do on the mountain, creating physiological changes in your body to more effectively be able to live and operate and excel at altitude. But we do some of that training in a much more comfortable way, which is at home, where we still have the best food that we can eat. We can train in a really effective way. We can be with family and friends and our work and things like that. So I think it's one of the very most effective ways we can add a jump start on acclimatization to go along with all the hard work you've done with cardio training and gaining experience and building technical skills to be successful in the mountains. Hello and welcome to the Duffel Shuffle. I'm Adrian Ballinger, and we're here to discuss the world of climbing and skiing in all its forms through the eyes of mountain guides.
And I'm Sam Kiekeffer. In each episode, we'll unpack exhilarating stories, share invaluable insights, and get up close and personal with some of the most experienced and passionate guides and athletes in the industry.
Whether you're a seasoned alpinist or a weekend warrior, the Duffel Shuffle is your ticket to the thrilling world of climbing, skiing, and mountaineering. Join us.
All right, welcome back. Episode 16 of the Duffel Shuffle podcast. Adrian, how are you?
I'm doing great. I like that you just guessed it's number 16, but you sounded so confident when you announced it.
You know, I think we're 16. They get a little bit jumbled together.
Is that a good sign? We've gotten to the point where we no longer know the number of our podcast recording. Let's call it a good sign.
I think so. It means we've recorded enough to forget which episode we're on specifically.
Absolutely. Great. Well, where are you?
I'm down in the Bay Area. I'm heading out of town out of SFO tomorrow. So came down. My folks live down here. So easy stop on the way out of town. How about yourself?
I'm down in the Bay Area too.
We're both in white rooms, but not the same room.
Exactly, with weird random artwork over my shoulder. But the fun thing about my work obligation down here was I actually got to fly my little plane down last night. It was like I haven't flown in a couple of weeks because I've been focused on climbing in Yosemite with them, and so I was excited to fly, and then it turned out to be really interesting weather with kind of like storminess over the mountains, and then a full, cloud layer down in the bay. So I got to fly instrument conditions and into the busy airspace, and just had a grand old time. So that was my evening.
All right, and are you heading back up to the mountains today?
Yeah, heading back up today. I think it's going to be bluebird, but breezy, so probably bumpy over the mountains, which is good. Then I'm alone. I enjoy turbulence more than my family sometimes does, and hopefully get back up in Tahoe in time for this afternoon. Actually, I'm sure I'll see you again this afternoon. We have our international guides meeting at Alpenglow Expeditions today, our sort of like quarterly get together to talk about any learnings from the past few months of trips, get our expedition doctor in there to yell at us about, safety and things like that a little bit, and chat about some new trips and things we have coming up. So always one of the highlights of my quarters is getting to see all the international guides on Zoom, if not in person.
Awesome. Well, you said you just got back from the Valley, or this is kind of your first work trip since focusing on some climbing in the Valley. How was the Valley? What's up in Yosemite this season?
Yeah, and actually I was just thinking about two fun things that maybe we can talk a little bit about. Obviously the Valley, and also then I did a quick trip to Boulder, Colorado for the American Mountain Guides Association annual meeting, which also was just one of these, I guess the things that excited me about both Yosemite and Boulder were like this realization of like, oh, the team is alive and well. I don't know how else to put that, but just like the climbing community felt so strong in both places and exciting, and things were happening that were inspiring, and just yeah, just this stoke in all the different forms, from like, especially in the valley, like the true dirt bags living in Camp 4, just climbing every day and never taking rest days and never showering and eating what food they can. Like that scene is totally alive and well. And then my like little personal scene, all of a sudden, we're actually getting campsites in the upper pines because we can't poach camping anymore because we've got families and dogs and babies and nannies. And there was like this whole scene of that, like Tommy and Becca and Alex and Sonny and Paige and Arian and me and Emily and SJ and Mikey, all these like climbers who have now young families still trying to make it work. So from the personal side, I just loved being a part of that. I got to climb a lot over the past month in the valley, but I'd say my primary focus was trying to support Emily as she was working on a kind of more difficult, bigger project than she's maybe done since having Arrow. So she was successful on the last possible day, sent this route called Nexus in really good style and super high pressure with like very cold weather and darkness coming and all the rest. It was epic to watch. And then the other fun thing was really seeing this like mix of, I guess, what I'd call the like kind of legends, the current legends of the valley, the Tommy Caldwells and Alex Honnold's, and Emily, and then this newer generation of Connor Herson and Nick Eamon and all these young climbers, like the guys who did the quad, linked 4 different routes this season in under 24 hours. And I I was enjoying. There's so much intermingling between these groups. I think it probably goes without saying there's no animosity, but it was just amazing to see like the young crew still kind of looking up to the legends and wanting to know how the techniques they use and wanting to go climbing with them and things like that. But then the vice versa totally being true, like the older crew like needing and wanting that young energy to climb with and play with, and also just to like to see that this next generation of climbers, and I put Connor Herson, a Black Diamond teammate of mine, at the very front of this, like the next generation is going to take things so much further. Like the level of raw talent, the level of commitment and effort and training of both bringing in like really high end sport climbing and like comp and gym climbing skills to now the biggest walls in the world. Like it's just amazing to watch and get a little taste of. So that that was kind of my Yosemite experience. And then the last possible day Emily could send her route, she sent her route. We were on the wall into the dark, pulling fixed lines, cleaning the route because she had a filmer with her and things like that. And then like late at night into the van, drove out to Fresno, and a few hours later I hopped on a flight and flew to Boulder for the American Mountain Guides Association annual meeting. And this is the meeting where the American Mountain Guides Association, as you well know, and our listeners probably know, we've talked quite a bit about it, the certifying body, the educating and certifying body of mountain guides in the US. And it's sort of partnered with all of the international mountain guides associations. And so the meeting is a combination of board meeting, kind of, talking about finances and education standards and technical standards and things like that I attended. The slideshows, I gave one slideshow at the Black Diamond store one night, and Joshua Harding gave it a slideshow the next night about guiding new unclimbed peaks in Pakistan. Kind of like a pretty cool edge case of mountain guiding that can happen. And then kind of the highlight of it is a party where the new fully certified guides get pinned. And this for me was like shocking. I haven't been in a few years. I think we talked about this. I think I was number 42. I was the 42nd guide in the United States to get pinned. And the idea of breaking 100 guides in the United States was hard to imagine. Well, now we've broken 200. And 3 nights ago, 15 new mountain guides were pinned, and they range from probably late 20s or maybe right around 30 to probably late 40s with families and kids and things like that. People who've been working on this for years to attain this full certification. And the like pride and effort and community feel of how the city that it took for each of these guides to become successful at finishing that, it just made me so excited for our guiding community and what's to come.
Yeah, it certainly is a special night for American mountain guides. I think I've never been to an annual meeting, but you certainly on social media, you see everyone getting their pins. And early on in my guiding career, I was taking the entry level courses, and I knew very few guys that were getting pinned. I knew guides that I had worked under that had their pin, but people that I had met through the process hadn't been to that level yet. And now, in this ceremony, I think I knew 5 of the 15 through working or coursework that I'd done. So cool to kind of see your peers now going through and getting their pin, and knowing those people that are finishing that process. So cool that you were there, and wild that there's more than 200 now. Do you know what the number of the latest was?
Yeah, it was through 215. So it was 200 to
Wow.
215 this year. Yeah. Really, really fantastic to see. And I hope that kind of momentum continues, and that we can continue to diversify who's a part of that group. There's still certainly too few women in that group. It still doesn't represent kind of the climbing community as a whole. And those are also things that I really see through the board meeting and things like that, the American Mountain Guide Association really focusing on and thinking about. And yeah, so much work to be done, and it's going to change so much in the next decade. But it was really, really great to see.
Awesome. Well, coming up, we're going to wrap up our conversation on high altitude. I cut you off last episode. We went away from rapid ascent. I know your favorite topic. So we're going to circle back on the conversation of high altitude and talk about the rapid ascent program that you've developed over the last little over a decade, and learn a little bit more. And that will be coming up next.
Let's go. Today's podcast is brought to you by Alpenglow Expeditions, a Tahoe-based guide company with an international reputation. In its 20th year of operations, Alpenglow leads the highest quality expeditions in some of the world's greatest mountain ranges, from California's High Sierra to the rugged Himalaya. Alpenglow runs more than 40 international expeditions per year, as well as offering a full menu of guided ski and climbing courses throughout California. Join us and experience the Alpenglow difference.
Welcome back to episode 16 of the Duffel Shuffle podcast. Adrian, last episode we were talking about altitude, your favorite topic, and I cut you off during your most favorite subtopic, pre-acclimatization, the Rapid Ascent program that you developed. Tell us about Rapid Ascent, pre-acclimatization. What do we have to learn about?
Sure. Well, I think it's one tool in this kind of like toolbox that we talked about last episode, right? From traditional acclimatization schedules to the use of prescription medications like Diamox and dexamethasone to the use of supplemental oxygen. All of these things can potentially make climbing mountains at altitude either easier or safer or both. And pre-acclimatization through the use of hypoxic tents is one more of those tools. And yeah, like you said, it happens to be one that I feel really strongly about because kind of I can give a little bit of the backstory of how it came to using them. But once I started seeing their effects both on me and on my clients and friends and partners, it was like just so obvious that I should lean in as hard as I could to it. But so, for people maybe joining this episode, if you haven't listened to the last one on more traditional acclimatization, how it works, why it works, what tools we use, definitely go back and check that out because I think pre-acclimatization rapid ascent only makes sense in context with that other information. But so essentially, we all know that high altitude expeditions are really long, and a lot of that time is spent. It's pretty boring some of the time, where there's a lot of downtime where we're just allowing our bodies to make the changes they need to, build new red blood cells, make other adjustments so that we can more effectively move oxygen around our system from our lungs to our muscles and brain. Pre-acclimatization is the use of hypoxic chambers, reduced oxygen chambers, where we can sort of front load some of that acclimatization, some of that time where we're just telling our body to make changes. We can do some of that work at home. And so that's kind of the dry description. Rapid Ascent is a little bit more than that. What we found was you couldn't just pre-acclimatize people at home in hypoxic chambers, then send them to the mountain and expect them to go much faster. It turns out that you also need much, much more dialed logistics, because a lot of the downtime on big mountains is actually when things are going wrong, right? The Jeep taking you to base camp breaks down, the helicopter doesn't fly, you get a little gastro stomach bug and have to sit around for a few days. The tents and ropes that you put up at Camp 1 and Camp 2 get wiped out by a storm and you have to start all over again. There's all these things that also make trips take a long time. And so there's no point in acclimatizing people and having them ready to go really fast if you don't also really dial logistics and decision making on the mountain and getting to the mountain to allow that client or climber that's now acclimatized to move quickly. But so rewinding a little bit where this all came from, I mean, I think for quite a while now in the climbing community, the idea of like smash and grab trips or like really fast, long single pushes in the mountains have been attractive to people. So instead of the more traditional sense of going somewhere and just spending a long, long time, whether it's in the Sierra and kind of leaving Tahoe, driving to the trailhead, racing into something like the Incredible Hulk, some big wall rock climb, climbing the wall, sending the route, coming all the way back out, back in your car and driving like In-N-Out Burger and getting a burger. Like that's something, those like fast ascents instead of like multiple days camping to do the same climb, that's always really attracted me. So I was always trying to think about how to be more efficient in the mountains. At the same time, by like the early like 2000s, like 2008, 9, 10, I was spending 8 months a year actually on expeditions between my own personal climbing plus my guiding for Alpenglow Expeditions. And it was so much time and it was starting to beat me down. I was starting to realize, honestly, like, that this is affecting my relationships with community. It's making it impossible to have a primary relationship that's healthy or to think about one day having a family. It was making it impossible to run Alpenglow really, as Alpenglow was starting to have some momentum in those late 2000s. Like I was too busy actually out guiding and trying to do things like client sales and business management like on a satellite phone in a tent. It was really impractical. So I was getting a little frustrated about my personal life, and I was seeing a lot of these like faster trips that my friends were doing more for low altitude objectives, and I was sort of like really envious of that. And I started hearing about these systems specifically from a company called Hypoxico that athletes like endurance runners were using before going to uh, things like endurance races like the Leadville 100. So races that had some altitude, both running and biking races. People that couldn't go and spend weeks in the mountains before the expedition were sleeping in these hypoxic chambers. And then they were going and they were performing well. So I had been hearing about those stories and was kind of interested in it. And then the first person I know who used a hypoxic tent for an expedition was Kenton Cool, a British mountain guide. He had a project where he essentially, I think he was working with Samsung and had to film a commercial and essentially only had 30 days to climb to get to the summit of Everest and make this phone call on this cell phone for Samsung, if I remember the story right. And so when I was hanging with him in base camp, I think this was in 2010 or 2011, hanging with him in base camp on the south side of Everest, he was talking about how he had pre-acclimatized, and that was part of how he was going to be able to climb this mountain. He had used a hypoxic tent both for training inside it and for sleeping inside it. And I was fascinated. So as soon as I finished my normal slow expedition, I went home and bought my first 10, started talking to the CEO of Hypoxico, whose name was Brian Ostrike. And he was also like kind of a passionate climber. He was more an endurance athlete, but he was a bit of a climber. And he was fascinated with the idea of using these tents for mountains. He was just so convinced it would work. And so I, I remember kind of like testing it for myself on a couple of lower altitude trips, and then um, testing it, even though at the time I was partnered with Alpenglow Expeditions was partnered with Himalayan Experience, Russell Bryce's company on Everest, and Russ really had no interest in shortening trips. I think the part of trips Russ loved the most was drinking whiskey and playing cards in base camp for weeks while waiting for the body to acclimatize to go climbing. Um, and I loved those times as well, and like learned so much from Russell during those years. But that's really the part of the trip I wanted to cut out. And so in that spring of 2012, I actually used a tent before going to Everest, but it wasn't official or anything like that. And I still did a normal slow trip. But once again, I noticed how much better I felt than I had in past trips. Very anecdotal, but I knew there was something there. And so I finally decided in the fall of 2012 to actually try this with a group, not just me, on a mountain. So I persuaded, I think, 6 guinea pigs to go to Makalu, the fifth tallest mountain in the world. And instead of doing the normal, basically no one climbed Makalu back in the early 2010s because it took over 2 weeks just to get to the base, trekking through this really low altitude terrain. So this was one of the very first times where we integrated both pre-acclimatization and then taking helicopters straight to base camp. And the base camp, or the advanced base camp on Makalu, is actually quite high. It's at almost 19,000 feet. So we flew in an entire group of people, mostly from sea level, although some of us live in places like Tahoe, to 19,000 feet, and immediately were able to begin climbing the mountain. And we had our expedition doctor with us, and we knew we were kind of like pushing the boundaries here, but everyone had kind of signed on and acknowledged this is what we're going to do. And while we didn't summit the mountain that year due to jet stream winds, we, like, everyone across the board was able to immediately live at 19,000 feet and begin climbing on the mountain much more quickly than we ever would have been able to before. So that's kind of the backstory of where it all started.
Well, I can see why we
And
saved a full episode for this, because I could take this conversation in so many directions.
and that was the intro.
All right. So I just want to start off, when we were talking about Diamox and dexamethasone, we talked about banned substance versus not a banned substance, and a fair tool. And obviously we're not talking about a substance here. We're talking about a process. But you mentioned that this tool, pre-acclimatization, was used for athletes racing at altitude or teams competing at a higher elevation than they're used to. Where does pre-acclimatization fall in that spectrum of, like, not banned necessarily, but how is it viewed in the professional world?
Yeah, great question, because it is important to think of kind of the ethics of these things. Pre-acclimatization in hypoxic tents is like relatively standard practice now in professional sports, and it's no different than using a treadmill, let's say, or a weight machine. It's just a piece of machinery that we are able to train with. I think in the last Olympics, there were at least a couple of hundred athletes who had used just the one system from Hypoxico. And then remember, there are other companies out there making these same things. Professional sports teams like the Miami Heat have used hypoxic training during preseason. So it's established. If you think kind of like, to compare it to something like the drug EPO, would do essentially the same thing as a hypoxic tent, but it is a banned substance because we're just putting something into our blood or injecting something that stimulates a hormonal response that builds more red blood cells, increases our hematocrit levels. That's not legal. But using a tool like a treadmill or a gym or a hypoxic tent to stimulate a response in your body, but your body's doing all the hard work, that is allowed. It's kind of no different than going to Mexico City or Colorado Springs to go train at altitude.
And so what does the tent do? What is happening behind the scenes in the tent, and what is it stimulating within your body?
Yeah, and we keep calling it a 10, which to describe a little bit. So there's two basic ways you can do hypoxic training. One is with a mask on connected to an oxygen concentrator that's essentially running in reverse. So instead of putting more oxygen into the mask, it's pulling oxygen out of the mask. You can wear that mask and you can run on a treadmill or ride on a stationary bike, or even I've used one with a long hose, like while climbing on a rotating climbing wall, like a tread wall. Um, we take that same oxygen concentrator working in reverse, but connect the hose to, we keep saying, a tent. You can either cover your entire bed in the tent, so your mattress and everything goes inside a large tent, or what's become more popular for most of us now is what we call a head tent. So it just goes over our pillow, and we kind of go from our body from about our shoulders up inside the tent. The nice thing about the head tent is you can still theoretically share your bed with a partner, or in my case, a partner and a dog. And the dog and the partner don't also have to be at simulated high altitudes. Um, and so, yeah, so it's basically using the oxygen concentrator in reverse. It's creating reduced oxygen air and then pumping it into the tent. Once that's been running for a few minutes, you essentially reduce the levels of oxygen in the tent. So it's what's called normobaric. We're not actually changing the pressure of the tent, because that would take like glass and steel. And this is like this lightweight, tiny little tent that you can travel with and things like that. Downsides, because everyone wants to know about downsides, like the oxygen concentrator running in reverse can be kind of noisy. So I use a long hose and put it outside of my room, but it can be annoying to some, especially light sleepers. The tent, especially if you're in a hot or humid environment, since your body is in there and there's limited airflow, it can be just uncomfortably kind of like hot. And then you can overdo it. You're essentially mimicking altitude in some ways in this reduced oxygen environment. So it could be, you can have symptoms of acute mountain sickness or altitude sickness, and that can certainly lead to bad sleep. That could be anything from headaches to nausea to just, unsettled sleep. And therefore, the risk is if we overdo it while pre-acclimatizing, we end up too fatigued to do effective training. And I think this is a really, really important point in this. Uh, we've now been doing this at Alpenglow Expeditions with thousands of clients over, more than a decade, since 2012. So we've seen a lot of clients, and in the early days, it was easy for people to think, oh, I'm doing this training, so I don't have to do that training. That training being all the slow base building work of building a cardio base, whether that's hiking or backcountry skiing or running. Um, this does something totally different and in no way replaces real training, physical training. And it can actually be a detriment to that really important base building training of cardio fitness if you're so dang tired every night from getting shitty sleep from being at high altitudes. And so it's a real dance finding the line where we can use these tools. They can effectively help us to acclimatize while not negatively affecting our training, especially for high end goals, things like no oxygen ascents of 8,000 meter peaks.
Well, and you've talked about the two styles of pre-acclimatization. One is train high and sleep low, or train at a simulated higher altitude and sleep at a lower altitude. And the other is train at your altitude that you live at and sleep at a higher simulated altitude. Alpenglow has obviously primarily used the train low and sleep high method for their acclimatization. Talk a little bit about the balance of the two of those, and kind of why Alpenglow has chosen to go one route primarily.
Yeah. And so, it's, of course, I expect anyone who goes in these tents or is thinking about using one of these tents probably does some research online about them, and you will find loads of different information out there. You'll find plenty of people saying they don't work even still today, which is kind of like mostly just entertaining to me at this point. But I think it is important to say, an important team member at Alpenglow Expeditions is Monica Pires, our expedition doctor, is based in Spain. Probably the most experienced high altitude doctor, at least in real, like in the field on expedition practice in the world. She's just done dozens of 8,000 meter peak expeditions. And so she always likes to keep me in line, especially when we started doing this in the 2010s. All of the information out there, almost all was anecdotal. It's actually quite difficult to do real hard science with large data sets utilizing these tools. Finally, the US military is starting to use hypoxic training more in hypoxic tents. So I expect we'll get much better data over the next few years. Um, so yeah, just recognize that that's maybe my caveat, that just recognize I'm talking anecdotally, but we're talking anecdotally now over, hundreds and hundreds of data points and myself. Um, but what we found is specifically for what we're doing, which is training for very high altitudes. This might be different than sports teams, for instance, training for not altitude actual performances. We're trying to actually prepare people for extreme altitudes. And what we've found is that it's actually the number of hours in the tent that really translates to true physiological change that's sustainable for when you finally get to the mountain a few days later. Um, so that's why we focus. It's really important to us that our people are spending at least 8 hours a day in the tent at simulated altitudes with reduced oxygen. So that hopefully is 8 hours of sleeping. Sleep's so important. We're just learning more and more the importance of sleep in training and performance. So hopefully that's 8 hours of sleeping. But if you're someone that's sleeping only 5 hours a night, then you got to find additional hours to be in the tent. That could be watching movies, taking phone calls, writing emails. I have written countless emails from inside my hypoxic tent. But it's that extended amount of time that seems to be stimulating the body to actually make physiological changes.
Awesome. Yeah. When I pre-acclimatized for Cotopaxi, I would get in the tent around 8 p.m. I would read or watch Netflix, fall asleep, sleep in it till about 4 a.m. And then, as you mentioned, it's not always the prettiest sleep. It's claustrophobic and hot. And so then from 4 a.m. to 6 or 7 a.m., I would take the tent off and get some like quality sleep. And that kind of allowed me to get that 8 hours while also, like maximizing my quality at the very end when I felt it really mattered. So definitely, it's not the prettiest situation, but the benefits are phenomenal, especially, when you talk about the greater ranges and limiting the expedition time at the higher altitudes. It's, completely unique compared to all other expeditions into those greater ranges.
Yeah, so we should, kind of touch on what we've found at Alpenglow over the years is combining this pre-acclimatization along with kind of those like just phenomenal logistics to not have lots of wasted downtime when things go wrong. We've been successfully able to reduce our expedition times, not only on 8,000 meter peaks, but also on 7,000 meter peaks like Lake Lenin and Aconcagua, also on 6,000 meter peaks like the volcanoes of Ecuador. We've been able to reduce those trip times by 30 to 50%. So a 60 to 70-day Everest trip becomes 35 days. A 23-day Aconcagua trip becomes, 12 days. Um, and and over now more than a decade of using this system, we've also noticed that we've actually become a safety rate has always been phenomenal. It was phenomenal before on traditional trips and it's phenomenal now. So safety has stayed similar, but our success rate has actually improved with shortening trips. And even to me, that was counterintuitive. I felt like, of going faster, pre-acclimatizing, I thought we might be able to match our previous success rates. Um, but I didn't think it made it any easier. So I didn't actually expect to see things improve. But I think what it is all these other external factors that when you go on Everest is the easiest example, a 65-day trip, there is going to be a percentage of people in every group that has to go home for something that often has nothing to do with the mountain. It's like they have a dental emergency or something happens at work at home or a family member has an issue and they need to go home and support. Well, if you can shorten that trip from 65 days to 30 days, it's just less likely those other things will happen while you're there. So I think we've seen that benefit. The other thing that I think has helped us in terms of success rates, and certainly that's been true with me, is when we're spending less time on the mountains, we're less likely to get sick with other things that just happen on trips, like gastrointestinal or upper respiratory illnesses. Those things usually happen in the first few days or couple weeks of a long trip. And I think it's in part because your body is fighting so hard to acclimatize that it then doesn't have as much reserves left for these other things that everyone experiences when we travel to developing countries in different parts of the world. Well, I think when you're pre-acclimatized, your body's slightly more able to then fend off those other gastro upper respiratory ailments. And then the last thing I've noticed, and this is very specific to me when I've been doing these really high, my no oxygen type ascents and trying to ski and things like that, is by being on a shorter trip, your summit push, which I equate to kind of like the championship game, right? That's the whole thing. You're hoping to peak at that time when you go for your summit push on a big mountain. Well, that summit push, that peak time is now closer to our training block and our rest. So I think we have more muscle. Our bodies are still more primed to put out their maximum effort than back in the day when I climbed these big mountains. Your body's just constantly being beaten down and getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And on a 2 month long expedition, by the time I actually got to summit push, a lot of times I've lost, 10% of my body weight. And a lot of that is muscle mass. And I'm actually really, really at one of the weakest points possible. Through rapid ascent, you've lost much less. So hopefully summit push feels better. You're stronger, more able to achieve what you want to. And then you come home and your recovery is actually faster to be able to reset and go to the next one.
I want to dive into the process and what the schedule of pre-acclimatization looks like. But before we do, you've mentioned a couple times that this program only really works in combination with logistics that are super dialed and the use of helicopters and things like that in certain areas. I think it's worth noting that the Rapid Ascent program doesn't really work in a country like Peru. It doesn't really work on a peak like Denali. Certainly it's been used in those areas and it can work, but the consistency of it is less likely because the logistics aren't there to support the program. The pre-acclimatization value can get easily thrown off by things like weather and the lack of use of helicopters and things like that.
Yeah, at least, I think Denali is an interesting example because I think Denali is one of the single best places for hypoxico use, actually, but maybe a little different than you're thinking. If you're joining a traditional guided trip from Alaska Mountaineering School, a mountain trip, they run one schedule. And that used to be true on Everest too. When we started doing this, no one did anything but 65-day trips and no one wanted to. And so loads of the early people who kind of heard me talking about pre-acclimatization and tents, they used them and then went on traditional trips and they had essentially no effect, right? And that's true if you used it for Denali and then you flew in and did a 3-week trip. But like Brian Ostreich, the CEO of Hypoxico, he did something that I just love doing so much now, right? He was living in New York, running his business, sleeping in his tent, waited until there was a good weather forecast on Denali. Everyone gets shut down because of bad weather on Denali. He waited in New York until there was a good 4-day forecast, caught a flight to Anchorage, Talkeetna, onto the mountain, 2 days of climbing. Denali is a relatively small mountain, actually, if the weather is good and you're not carrying a huge sled. And summited in 48 hours, flew back out, and was back in New York working on Monday. And so, I think that's a great example of a place where if you're climbing on your own for yourself, a smash and grab expedition, even on a hard route on Denali, is totally possible. And you can actually avoid a lot of the pain and suffering of horrible weather through using pre-acclimatization. But you need to plan your logistics to match that.
Well, and absolutely. I think the key there is that he left when the weather forecast was good, right? If you have set dates
That's
on a
right.
peak like Denali, there's not enough time, or you get on the mountain and then you get shut down by weather and you're at 7,000 feet and you lose your pre-acclimatization. So certainly the logistic
Absolutely right.
requirements are even higher if you're using the system on a peak like Denali.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
So let's dive in a little bit to
Yeah, and
the
I think
process of acclimatization and what does the schedule for sleeping in the tent look like? How long do you use it for? Do you go right up to the altitude and just suffer for as long as you can? What does that whole system look like?
yeah. So again, over this, I guess we're 12 years in now. Over the 12 years, I think we've learned a lot about what schedules work and don't work. And one of the biggest things I've learned is we used to push people too hard, and we were too far on the side of needing to acclimatize using the tent to the detriment of the training that people need to do and the good sleep that people need to be getting. And so we've pretty dramatically reduced kind of the speed of schedules. But I think it's important to know another thing we've added is no one uses, we don't recommend using pre acclimatization or hypoxic tents for your first time going to altitude because you are going to experience some symptoms of acute mountain sickness. Those symptoms are kind of the warning signs that you might be pushing too hard, but they're also, essentially the stimulus is telling your body to make changes. And so we think it's really important to go with a guide or people more experienced than you to true altitude for the first time and learn how your body acclimatizes and then utilize that knowledge for your tent pre-acclimatization because everyone's schedule is actually going to be different, just like everyone's schedule in the mountain is different. The vast majority of people can acclimatize to moderate altitudes, but they do it at different paces, and people get in trouble when they use someone else's pace. So while we do send kind of like a recommended schedule to begin, it is essential that each person is adapting and changing that schedule in conversation with, the experts. If it's with Alpenglow, that's through the office to the guides and sometimes to our expedition doctor. But you really need to be adjusting the use of the tent based on your acclimatization. So, um, you know, hop in the tent. I used to be famous for like hopping in. I live at 6,000, so I just crank it right up to 16,000, and that's not effective, and it's super suffery. Um, so now I start much lower. If I live at 6, I might be starting in the tent at like 9 or 10. If I'm at sea level, I might be starting at 5 or 6. We want to like give ourselves enough time to break in slowly. And there's a couple of tools we can use to make sure we're being safe while we do this. One, you can actually use an oxygen meter and set alarms on it so that if for some reason the unit malfunctioned and the level went much lower, you're going to get a warning. And of course, you're also going to wake up with a headache. So it's pretty easy to know if something's going wrong with the tent. But the second thing I use a lot is a pulse oximeter. Pulse oximeters, a lot more people know about them now because they became popular during COVID to have home pulse oximeters. But these little devices that actually are measuring how much, a percentage out of a possible 100%, how much oxygen your hemoglobin, your blood is actually carrying at any one time. And the way I encourage people to kind of utilize their tent is you want that number to drop. Let's say at sea level, that number is going to be 98, 99, maybe 96 if you're a bit older and you've smoked a lot or something like that in your life. But we want to drop that number out of the 90s and into the 80s perhaps, but we don't want to be dropping that number down into the 70s or 60s or anything like that. We want to be in this range where we're creating a stimulus for the body, but not creating so much pain that we sleep terribly, and we're just going to adjust that. And so over a period of weeks, it's funny, it happens slowly. Like sometimes I'll be like, shoot, my sats are still they're still like 86, 88, and I haven't gotten above 10,000 feet, and I've been in this tent for a week. It's not working. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh wait, I'm in the 90s. I woke up in the morning, I'm in the 90s. I got up to pee, I'm in the 90s. I need to bump up. And it just progresses. And so I just adjust my altitude based on my pulse oximetry through the night and in the morning before I get out of the tent. Along with, we talk about the Lake Louise score, basically like, a 1 to 5 count of do you have altitude symptoms, headaches, nausea, difficulty sleeping, things like that.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. The use of the pulse oximeter is sometimes a benefit because you have data point, that touch point. But at the same time, sometimes you're like comparing your scores, and there's so many factors that go into it: how you sleep, how much rest you got. And I definitely in both pre-acclimatization and also in the mountains have gotten into my own head with those scores, right? And those little finger pulse oximeters aren't always the most
Sure.
accurate tools. So it's just one of the data points. Like you said, there's other data points that are important to factor in as well. And especially amongst team members, if you know someone else on an expedition that's pre-acclimatizing, or when you're on an expedition, comparing scores does absolutely nothing, because everyone is a little bit different. And
Nothing.
because one person's at 89 and another person's at 92 is not that big of a deal.
Yep. Really important that you're using that like pulse oximetry data for your own trend. And like you said, you're using it as one piece of data along with like these other symptoms you might be feeling. And also, like I wear a Coros watch that does great sleep data at this point. You know, that's a great additional data point. You can see your sleep quality and how much are you reducing your sleep quality. Like, of course, it's acceptable and expected to reduce your sleep quality when sleeping at simulated altitude. But are you going too far? Are you going in a deep hole that you can't get back out of? Do you need a night out of the tent? Like, this is something we used to be anti, and now we're like, look, if you're doing a really hard training block, take a night out of the tent. If you feel like you're starting to get a cold or you're starting to get sick, take a night out of the tent. Like, it's not nothing about high altitude is like scuba diving, where if you take the mask off, you can't breathe and you're going to die in 60 seconds. Like, this is all something we can kind of play with. Is it better to stay in the tent? Sure. Would it be better to be in the tent 24 hours a day? Of course. But is that realistic? No. And so you're trying to find that balance. And then big picture schedule, like what we found is for a 6,000 meter peak, 6 to 7,000 meters, 4 weeks in the tent really gives you the ability to make real changes that are going to help you on the mountain. For an 8,000 meter peak, like a lower one, like a Gasherbrum or a Cho-Oyu or a Manaslu, I think 6 weeks is pretty practical. And for an Everest ascent or K2 or something in the highest altitudes, I think 8 weeks in the tent tends to be effective. It gives you time to go slowly. It gives you time to be out of the tent to recover if you need to. An occasional night here and there. It's not so much time that you're going to ruin the rest of your life. And you don't want to be in these tents permanently in the same way that you don't want to be living at altitude permanently. It's really important that this is like a cyclical thing. It's a period. It's a block that you're doing, and then you're back out of it. And I think it's very important for people to know, like, we're not acclimatizing people for the summit of their objective with that time, that 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks. The goal is essentially to train people to base camp so we can skip a lot of the downtime of getting to base camp. This is like what you mentioned, whether it's instead of a long trek, we use a helicopter or a Jeep, or we just hike fast or run in. That's something I used to love to do, is instead of walking over 10 days from Lukla, where you fly in the Khumbu Valley for Everest, and then take 10 days walking to base camp. Well, you can run it in 2 days if you're acclimatized and if you have the logistics to keep, to bring your stuff up with you and have what you need. And so we're acclimatizing people to base camps, and then we're acclimatizing people so that when they reach base camp, they can feel good instead of terrible, and they can almost immediately begin doing acclimatization rotations higher. Once we're on the mountain, things go back to a relatively traditional acclimatization system of climbing up, causing suffering, going back to base camp to rest and recover, and then doing it again. On a 6,000 meter peak, you might only have to do one rotation. On an 8,000 meter peak, you might have to do 2 or 3 rotations. But all we've done is been able to dive into that process much more quickly. Most of the time we save is on the early end of the trip.
Awesome. Well, it's been a pretty comprehensive coverage of pre-acclimatization and rapid ascent. Give us your 1 minute elevator pitch as to why someone should explore this for their next expedition.
The elevator pitch is the rapid ascent systems, when used effectively, both pre-acclimatization at home and excellent logistics and leadership, effectively make high altitude trips shorter and more fun. And I would argue increase both safety and success rates. And they do that by doing exactly the same thing you're going to do on the mountain, creating physiological changes in your body to more effectively be able to live and operate and excel at altitude. But we do some of that training in a much more comfortable way, which is at home, where we still have the best food that we can eat. We can train in a really effective way. We can be with family and friends and our work and things like that. So I think it's one of the very most effective ways we can add a jump start on acclimatization to go along with all the hard work you've done with cardio training and gaining experience and building technical skills to be successful in the mountains.
Are there any tweaks you're making to the system or cool things that you want to change to achieve something even greater in the future?
Yeah, I mean, we're constantly testing new or updated systems from Hypoxico and other companies. And we're also always playing with protocols. Like, actually, I have found that we've been adding back in some of that higher altitude short training sessions with the mask based system, where while we're sleeping, for safety and for all the reasons we've talked about, we're not really pushing the altitude very high, very fast. Well, it is, if nothing else, for someone who loves suffering like me, it feels really good for 60 minutes to get on a stationary bike or a treadmill and bump up to like 23,000 feet of altitude and drop your sats down to oxygen saturations down into the 60s and like actually try and feel that pain. And there's some research out there that those really high altitude, kind of short stimulant experiences do also encourage the body to acclimatize. So we're playing with some of that. We don't have strong recommendations for people yet, but I kind of on phone calls talk about it like this, like, hey, give it a try. You're not going to hurt yourself if you're awake and only doing it for 45 minutes or an hour. Like, so go feel what it feels like and see what you can do and
Mm-hmm.
try to push through, and maybe that has a good stimulus. I think the exciting thing that I hope to see change in these systems that we're working with people on is right now the oxygen concentrators that are being used in reverse. They weigh about 70 pounds. And so while the tent is really small and packed up and you can travel with, I've traveled all over the world with my Hypoxico system. And it is a total pain in the ass. And so
Airlines love
there
you.
are experiments out there for, yeah, exactly. There are people working on having lighter weight, more packable systems that would be easier to travel with, and that would be a huge bonus for what we and so many people in our orbit do, where they need to be able to take their systems with them.
Well, anecdotally, I one of my first altitude experiences was a rapid ascent trip to Ecuador, climbed Cotopaxi, and I was a total hater when I was sleeping in the tent. I was like, "This is awful," and now I can't wait to do it again because it's a tool. And no, it's not a fun tool, but it's a tool that allows you to do some really cool things in the mountains in a much shorter amount of time. And so, for people with limited schedules, for people with family obligations, work obligations, whatever, or just people that don't want to spend, a month potentially getting a gastro illness in the Kumbu, it's an amazing tool to allow you to climb some of the coolest mountains in the world in a different manner.
Yeah, absolutely. I hear that story so much as well from clients and friends, and now most professional athletes that you've heard about the climbing the big mountains have used these systems, and many times the first experience is like, this can't be worth it. Like, this is bad for my relationship, and I don't like the noise, and like it's hot, especially, is a big one in the summer and northern hemisphere, and then when they see the effects on the mountain for the first time, it's like, wow, like I have to use this. It's a tool that's really, really effective. um and I guess the one other thing I'd mention, we kind of touched on this a couple of times. This is my pitch for Alpenglow Expeditions. But one thing we've seen is a lot of copycats out there in the industry now with this system. And of course, being able to pre-acclimatize is not unique to Alpenglow. We were the first, and really proud of kind of the pioneering we did in that space. But many people now use these systems. But I think what you mentioned with your example, even of like Peru or Denali or something like that, Sam, is so important that like, number one, utilizing pre-acclimatization effectively takes expertise. You want to be with a company with deep, deep expertise in these systems. And number two, they must be paired with logistics that work for rapid ascent, for going faster in the big mountains. And that, in many ways, is the difficult part. And the special sauce is having like a company that is just deeply dedicated to the logistics it takes to take advantage of your pre-acclimatization that you've worked and suffered for. So find a company that is incredible at logistics and that believes in this system. One of the biggest mistakes I see in the Himalaya is people still today trying to run expeditions that are mixed clients. Some clients on a traditional trip that come for 8 weeks to Everest, and some clients that come for 35 days. So those 8 week clients, they've been on the mountain for 3 weeks already. They've formed bonds. They've worked with Sherpa. They've done all these things in this slow method. And then these like hot shots parachute in, who are pre-acclimatized. And I still just see this like antagonism and conflict and like, I'm going to prove this was the better way to do it or this was the better way to do it. And the logistics operators are trying to balance both and make the best of both worlds and it doesn't work. And the teams fall apart and they have failures and they don't have fun. So, like I said, this is my Alpenglow plug, but like, when we saw that this worked better and was safer, this is now the only way we run most of our big mountains. And we don't try to mix fast and slow. Everything is built from start to finish to be effective and maximize safety and success for rapid ascent pre-acclimatized clients. And I think that is a really important part of the formula that makes it work.
Well, Adrian, thank you for your time today. It's been a phenomenal conversation about rapid ascent pre-acclimatization. It's a fascinating system, and I would encourage everyone to check it out, whether that's for your own personal adventures or for a family member that you want to come home sooner.
Absolutely right. When are you next going to be in a hypoxic tent, Sam? Do you know?
Oh, that's a great question. I would love for you to answer that for me, but I'll be going to Japan for a ski trip next, so I'm not thinking about pre-acclimatizing at all.
All right. Yeah, you will not need extra red blood cells there.
Thanks for listening to episode 16 of the Duffel Shuffle podcast. This is the second part to a conversation about climbing at high altitude and the process of acclimatization. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and as always, please subscribe, rate us, and leave us a review. We're going to start launching episodes on Wednesdays, so stay tuned for episode 17 coming at you on Wednesday, December 4th. And until then, we hope you enjoy some time outside.